Hey y'all, we are getting ready to add the neck trim to our pinafore top. Right now I am looking at the wrong side of my garment and this is the left strap. This is the stitch marker that I placed before beginning my right and left straps. I went ahead and placed a second stitch marker 4 stitches up from that first one to indicate where I'm going to begin picking up stitches. In order to get started, I have my project needles, I have my trim color yarn, and I've got my project. So I'm going to go ahead and pick my project up, and I'm going to look at that stitch 4 stitches up from the stitch marker that I placed, this one. So 1, 2, 3, 4, that's this stitch right here. Now these stitches that I'm looking at this is the first slipped stitch of each row. And so you'll notice that it makes a really nice edge for picking up stitches, and I'll show you what I mean. So the first thing that I'm going to do is grab my yarn, and I'm now looking at the right side of my strap. And I'm going to start at this stitch, and I'm going to insert my needle right behind both legs of that stitch to pick up a stitch. I like to anchor my yarn in my pinky finger. And then I just go behind both legs of that stitch, wrap my yarn, and pull a stitch up. This is the first stitch that I've picked up. We're going to now go to the next stitch over. I'm going to go behind both legs, wrap my yarn, pick it up. If you knit English, I'll show you what this looks like. Next stitch, behind both legs, wrap your yarn, pull it through. Go to the next stitch. Insert your needle behind both legs of the stitch, wrap your yarn, pull it through. The last stitch that we will be working is the stitch that we originally marked. Behind both legs, wrap the yarn, pull it through. Now we're going to turn our work and work the other direction. For this next setup row, we're going to be purling into the front and back loop of each stitch to double our stitch count to 10 stitches. So to purl through the front and back loop, I'm going to first go into that stitch as if to purl, pulling my yarn through. Now I'm not going to slip my stitch off. Instead, I'm going to now purl through the back loop of that same stitch. So that one stitch that I just worked turned into 2 stitches. I'll show you that again. Purl through the front loop, keep the stitch on, purl through the back loop. If you knit English, this is what this might look like. Purl through the front loop, keep the stitch on, purl through the back loop. Now you can slide that stitch off. You may have to pull the tail of your yarn to get those first stitches snug, but I'll show you that again. We're going to purl through the front loop, keep the stitch on, purl through the back loop, and remove the stitch. And we're going to do that for the last stitch as well. Purling through the front loop, leaving the stitch on, purling through the back loop. We're done with our setup row now. At this point, this is what your project is going to look like. You will have picked up those stitches along your left strap. You doubled the stitches up, and now we're going to put all of our active neckline stitches. We're going to slip those onto our left hand needle. I'll meet you on the other side. At this point, I have my neckline trim stitches. I have 10 of these, and then I have my active neckline stitches on my needle. I'm going to go ahead and pick up my work. And now you're going to begin a 2-row repeat. When our stitches are pushed up on our needle, this is what it's going to look like. And I'm going to go ahead and start my 2-row repeat. On each row, I'm going to be decreasing one of my active neckline stitches. And I'll show you how I'm going to do that. So I'm going to slip the first 2 stitches with my yarn in the back. I'm going to knit a stitch. I'm going to purl, knit 2, purl 1, knit 2. When I get to that last trim stitch, I'm going to purl 2 together with one of my neckline stitches, decreasing my neckline stitches by 1. Before I turn my work, with my yarn in front, I'm going to slip 1 stitch purlwise. Then I'm going to turn my work, and I'm going to knit 2 together. Then I'm going to purl 2, knit 1, purl 2, knit 1, and purl 3. And then I'm going to turn my work. So that is my 2-row repeat, and I'm going to repeat those 2 rows until I only have 10 stitches left on my needle, and they will be your 10 trim stitches that are left on the needle. I'll meet you on the other side. All right, y'all. At this point, we have worked all of our active neckline stitches, and all we have left is our 10 neck trim stitches. Now we need to do one final row to decrease our stitch count by 5, and then we're going to go ahead and graft those 5 stitches to our right strap. So I am going to knit 2 together across. And now we're going to cut our yarn, leaving a nice 12-inch tail. Before I start grafting my stitches to my strap, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to mark my straps just like I did with the left side. I'm going to get this first stitch, and then I'm going to go 4 stitches up from there. Mark that stitch. And this is where I will be grafting my neck trim to my strap. So I'll go ahead and I will thread the tail of my yarn onto my darning needle. I'm going to pick up my project. Alright, so the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to thread my darning needle knitwise through the first stitch on my needle. Then I'm going to go to my first marked stitch on my strap, and I'm going to thread my darning needle, and I'm going to thread my darning needle behind both legs of that stitch. And then I'm going to go 1 stitch up, and I'm going to go down behind both legs of that stitch. And then I'm going to go back to my needle, and I'm going to go purlwise through that first stitch, slipping it off my needle. All right, so now we're going to go to the next active stitch on our needle. We're going to go knitwise into that stitch. We're going to leave it on the needle. We're going to go up behind the legs of that second stitch. We're going to go 1 stitch over then, and we're going to go down behind the legs of that stitch. Now we're going to go back to the first stitch on our needle, and we're going to go purlwise, slipping it off. All right, so now we're going to go to the next active stitch on our needle. We're going to go knitwise, leaving the stitch on the needle. We're going to go up through. We're going to go up behind the legs of the stitch you just came down through. Going to go over a stitch to go down behind the legs of that stitch. Back to the first active stitch on our needle to go purlwise and off. We're going to go to the next active stitch on our needle, knitwise, leaving the stitch on. We're going to go up behind the legs of the stitch you just came down through. We're going to go over a stitch to go down behind the legs of that stitch. Purlwise through that stitch off the needle, pulling the yarn through. I've got one last stitch. I'm going to go knitwise, leaving the stitch on the needle. I'm going to go up behind the legs of the stitch I just came down behind. I'm going to go one stitch over to go behind the legs of that stitch. And then we're going to go purlwise off the needle. And then all you have to do is pull the yarn taut and kind of distribute the tension between those stitches. So now you've grafted your neck trim to your right strap, and you can go ahead then and close any gaps